Dodie Prue called the house line at 20 past 6 and said there was a coat in the water at the town float, and would Ruth come down? And then he said, never mind about the coat. And then he didn't say anything at all. And Ruth was already putting her boots on. She took the truck down Water Street with the defroster roaring at half a windshield of frost. 3rd of November. Hard cold for a week now. The leaves down and done. Every lawn on the street gone stiff and silver. The Marrow's porch light still on. Nobody else up. Where the street bent at the old cannery, she could see the whole lower harbor, laid out flat as sheet tin. The tide dead low, mud banks showing along the channel like the backs of animals, and the town float sitting at the bottom of its ramp a long way below the landing. One figure on the wharf, standing very still. Dodie. She parked at the head of the ramp and left the truck running with the heater on, because in an hour there would be people standing around with nothing to do, and somewhere warm to put them was part of the job. Then she went down, keeping to the dry side of the ramp where the frost hadn't been walked on. Dodie Prue was 71 years old and had opened the bait shop at 5:30 every morning of his adult life. He stood at the bottom of the ramp holding a boat hook he had clearly forgotten he was holding. His mouth was working like a man rehearsing a speech. She took the hook from him gently and leaned it against the rail. "Go up and sit in the truck, Dodie." He didn't move. His eyes went past her, down the float, and would not come back. "Dodie, go sit in the truck." That worked. She listened to him go up the aluminum ramp, one rail grab at a time, and then she turned around. The float rode low under her weight. The water alongside it was the color of pot metal and barely moving. The last of the ebb draining out through the mooring field in long seams, and Faye was against the middle piling where the current had pinned her, face down, her green wool jacket ballooned at the shoulders, one arm through the lowest rung of the ladder as if she had been climbing it. She was not climbing it. Ruth crouched at the float's edge and did not touch her. Look, don't touch. Rules were useful. She made herself take the inventory in order, the way a sergeant whose face she could no longer call up had trained her to 25 years ago in another life. The float itself, dock lines coiled and hung, fenders in their places, the gearbox padlocked, Faye's skiff on its outhaul 40 feet off, hauled up snug the way Faye left it every night of her life. No line in the water, no bucket, no bait iron, no dropped glove. The hose reeled. The sign about the pump-out station screwed to its post, listing 2 degrees the way it had listed for years. Faye's boots were still on. Wool jacket, wool hat gone, the braid come loose and moving a little where the current combed it, and Ruth looked at that for exactly as long as the inventory required, and then looked at the ladder. Frost furred every rung. It had furred the rails and the cleats and the gearbox hasp, a freezer's worth of it, undisturbed. Except the top 2 rungs of the ladder were wet. Dark, clean, wet steel, beaded along the undersides. She looked at the water line against the piling, 6 feet down and falling. Low water in maybe 40 minutes. The tide hadn't been within reach of those rungs since before midnight. Up the harbor, a diesel turned over, ran rough, and caught. Marden, probably, hauling his last 100 traps on a Tuesday. He was 100 yards away. She took out her book, the little all-weather one, the habit that had outlived the job that made it, and wrote the date and 6:52 a.m. and slack low approx. 7:30 hung, and top 2 rungs wet, frost intact elsewhere. And then she knelt there with the pen capped and made herself say it, quietly, out loud, because somebody was going to have to be the first one to say it, and it was not going to be Dodie Prue. Okay, Faye. Her voice came out level. She stood up and climbed back to the wharf and made the calls. The county dispatcher took the particulars twice, the second time slower. State Police Detective Division for any unattended death, the ME's office out of Augusta, the volunteer ambulance, which was a formality with its own dignity and which everyone would have wanted. Ruth gave the dispatcher the tide window without being asked, told her the recovery would need to happen off a float at dead low with no crane access, heard her write it all down wrong, and let it go. By 8:15, the wharf had collected what a November morning in Wicket Harbor had to give. Martin had come back in without hauling, the diesel she'd heard, and stood with two of the co-op men by the ice house, hats off, then hats back on because of the cold, then off again when the ambulance backed down. Norma Prue came for Dodie with the truck still running and took him home by the arm like a boy leaving a fight. Somebody had called the church because the church lady's first casserole was already riding in a warm dish on the seat of a Buick, aimed at a griever not yet chosen. The ambulance was Nate Coombs and the tar box kid because it was a Tuesday, and that was the Tuesday crew. Nate backed the rig to the ramp head in one pass, got out, and stood looking down at the float for a count of 5 with his hands loose at his sides. Then he came over to Ruth. "Water recovery," he said. "So it's us and you, and the state's an hour out if they're driving well. You want to wait on them? ME's office says we can recover. They want photographs first. I've got them." She had taken them on the department camera, and then again on her own phone, which was either thoroughness or distrust, and she hadn't examined which. Nate nodded slowly. He was looking at the skiff on its outhaul, then at the ladder, then at the water, and his face wasn't doing anything at all, which she would think about later. Everyone else's face that morning had been doing something. The wharf was a gallery of faces doing things, and Nate's was just reading the scene, left to right, like a page. "Slack in 20 minutes, he said. "Best do it in slack. Current'll swing her when it turns." "I know it. I know you know it." He said it plain, an apology for the obviousness, and went to get the basket litter. The recovery took 11 minutes, and Ruth logged every one of them. Nate went down into the skiff they borrowed, off the next float over. Nobody so much as glanced toward Faye's. And the tar box kid, who was 19 and green as paint, held position with 2 boat hooks and did fine. Did fine right up until Faye came free of the piling and turned face up in the litter with the water running off her. And then he sat down hard on the float's edge and was quietly sick into the harbor. And nobody said one word to him about it, then or ever. Nate worked with his gloves off. She noticed that without deciding to. He squared Faye's jacket where it had ridden up and tucked the loose braid inside the collar before the straps went on. The piling blocked him from the wharf. Then came the straps, the lift, the slow walk up the ramp with the weight between 4 of them, and the doors of the rig closing with the sound those doors make, which is like no other sound, twice as loud in a quiet harbor. The wharf emptied by degrees. Casseroles found their heading. Faye had no husband and no children. The Buick idled a long minute and then aimed itself at Faye's sister-in-law on Crockett Point. The co-op men went back to the ice house and stood not working. Martin went out again, because 100 traps in the water don't care. And everyone watched his boat go down the channel and was glad of something ordinary to look at. Nate came back from the rig with a clipboard and stood beside her filling in the run report. For a while, neither of them said anything. and it was the companionable kind of nothing, which she'd remember afterward and turn over. Dodie found her? 6:20, she was against the middle piling. Ebb would put her there. He wrote something. If she went in off the float, anywhere along it, on the ebb, that piling's where she'd fetch up. If she went in on the ebb, Ruth said. Nate's pen kept moving. State'll do all that arithmetic, he said, mild as milk. Augusta loves arithmetic. He signed the sheet and clicked the pen. He looked at her longer than the paperwork required. You'll be the one going through her office, I expect. Town stuff. Somebody'll have to. Somebody will? Well, he said, you know where I am. And he took the run report up to the rig and drove Faye out of the harbor at 15 miles an hour. No lights, the way it's done when there is no hurry left to be in. What was left, at the end of it, was Ruth alone on the wharf at 9:30 with the tide turned and the first of the flood pushing back in through the moorings, and the town gone back indoors to begin the work of telling it. She knew already the shape the telling would take. Faye had gone down at first light to check the float ice, or the outhaul, or any of the 10 dutiful reasons Faye went anywhere. Frost on the rungs, boots on wet aluminum, a slip, a strike of the head, the water doing the rest. It was a good story. It was a kind story, even. A harbor master lost to the harbor in the course of her duties, no one at fault, nothing to be done. By supper it would be settled all over town the way weather gets settled, and every mention of it for 30 years would begin. The morning Faye slipped. Ruth stood at the head of the ramp and ran it once more against what she had written in the book. Wet rungs 6 feet above a midnight waterline. Frost everywhere the water couldn't reach, except where it wasn't. A slip on the morning ice, and a woman in the water half the night ahead of the ice she slipped on. Before she went up, she walked out along the wharf to the harbor master's office to lock it. Because the town's property was her lookout now, and the state would want the office sealed. The office was already locked. Faye's keys were in the door, on the outside, the whole heavy ring of them hanging quiet in the lock with the harbor moving underneath. The door locked, checked, done for the night, and the keys left behind in it, which Faye Metivier had not done one time in 22 years. Ruth stood looking at them a good while. Then she photographed them where they hung and did not touch the door, and went up to open the town office because it was 9:30 on a Tuesday. And that was the job.